The rusted padlock on Grandpa's barn had been there for 30 years, and Jake Miller never questioned why. Standing in the Iowa cornfields 3 days after the funeral, the 28-year-old farmer finally held the key his grandfather had pressed into his palm with his dying breath. The barn door creaked open, releasing air that smelled of motor oil and something else, something metallic and wrong. Jake's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing not farming equipment, but rows of carefully preserved vintage cars. Beautiful, pristine vehicles that made his breath catch, until he noticed the license plates. All from the 1990s, all reported stolen. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. It was the wall covered in newspaper clippings, police reports and photographs. Missing persons cases spanning 3 decades, and in the center, a map with red pins marking locations across the Midwest. Locations that matched exactly with Grandpa's business trips. Jake stumbled backward as the terrible truth crashed over him. His beloved grandfather, the man who taught him to fish, to farm, to be honest, had been living a double life. What would you do if you discovered your hero was actually a monster? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's hands trembled as he aimed the flashlight at the nearest newspaper clipping. The headline screamed, "Local teacher vanishes without trace." Below it, a photograph showed a smiling woman in her 30s standing beside a blue Honda Civic. Jake's beam swept to the garage floor, where that same blue Honda sat beneath a tarp, its paint still gleaming, as if it had been lovingly maintained. His stomach lurched. He pressed his back against the barn wall, trying to steady himself, but his shoulder knocked against something hard. Turning, he found a metal filing cabinet, its drawers slightly ajar. With shaking fingers, he pulled open the top drawer. Inside were manila folders, each labeled with a name and date. The organization was meticulous, almost professional. Jake grabbed the first folder with numb fingers. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots of a young man leaving work, walking to his car, completely unaware he was being watched. The timestamp showed the photos were taken over several weeks. The final page in the folder was a death certificate. "No, no, no," Jake whispered, dropping the folder. Papers scattered across the concrete floor, but he couldn't stop himself from opening another drawer. More folders, more names, more careful documentation of lives that had been, ended. The word murder felt too large, too impossible to apply to the man who used to make him pancakes shaped like tractors. Jake's grandfather, Earl Miller, had been the town's most respected citizen. He'd served on the church board for 40 years, donated anonymously to families in need, and never missed a high school football game. When Jake's parents died in a car accident 15 years ago, Earl had raised him with infinite patience and love. The man Jake knew couldn't have hurt a fly, literally. He'd seen his grandfather carefully relocate spiders rather than kill them. But the evidence surrounding Jake told a different story. A story of systematic hunting that had gone on for decades, right under everyone's noses. The business trips that took Earl away for weeks at a time suddenly made horrifying sense. Jake had always assumed his grandfather was buying and selling farm equipment at auctions across the state. He'd never questioned why Earl always returned alone, without any new equipment, claiming the deals hadn't worked out. Jake forced himself to look at the map more carefully. Red pins dotted Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Next to each pin was a small white label with a date. The earliest date was from 1962, the year Earl bought the farm. The most recent was from just 6 months ago. 6 months ago, when Earl had claimed he was checking out a combine harvester in Cedar Rapids. Jake's knees gave out, and he slumped to the floor. His mind raced through every memory, searching for signs he'd missed. Earl's insistence on privacy, his old-fashioned ways that meant no one else ever came into the barn, the way he'd always seemed to know exactly what people were thinking, what they feared. Jake had attributed it to wisdom, but now he wondered if it was something much darker. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. A text from his girlfriend. "Sarah, how are you holding up? Want me to bring dinner over tonight?" He stared at the message, realizing he could never tell anyone what he'd found. Not Sarah, not the police, not anyone. Because admitting Earl's guilt would mean admitting his own willful blindness. It would mean acknowledging that he'd been living on a farm built with blood money, raised by a man whose kindness to him had been purchased with other people's lives. Jake's boots crunched through the frost-covered grass as he approached the weathered barn the next morning. Coffee steam rose from his thermos in lazy spirals, dissipating into the crisp October air. He'd barely slept, his mind churning over the implications of what he'd inherited along with 60 acres of Pennsylvania farmland and a house that creaked like a ship in a storm. The barn loomed before him, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Grandfather Marcus had always kept it locked, claiming it housed nothing but old farming equipment and memories too heavy to sort through. Now Jake understood there might be truth in that, just not the kind he'd expected. He'd found the keyring in Marcus's desk drawer, along with a handwritten note that simply read, "The past has teeth, Jacob. Some doors are meant to stay closed," typical of his grandfather's cryptic warnings, though Jake had always assumed they were just the ramblings of an old man who'd seen too much of the world's darkness during his years as a small-town sheriff. The padlock clicked open with surprising ease. Jake wrapped his fingers around the barn door's iron handle, feeling the weight of decades pressing against the other side. The hinges protested with a sound like grinding bones as he pulled the massive door open. Sunlight slanted through the doorway, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the stale air. The barn was larger than it appeared from outside, stretching back into shadows that seemed to swallow light. Along the walls, farming equipment sat under canvas tarps like sleeping giants. A rusted John Deere tractor dominated the center space, its green paint mottled with age spots. But it was what lay beyond the tractor that made Jake's breath catch. In the far corner, partially hidden behind stacks of hay bales, stood what looked like a makeshift office, a wooden desk, filing cabinets, and a corkboard covered in yellowed papers and photographs. Jake set down his thermos and moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The desk was meticulously organized, despite the layer of dust coating everything. File folders were arranged in neat stacks, labeled with dates spanning from 1978 to 1995. Jake opened the nearest folder and found himself staring at crime scene photographs that made his stomach lurch. Bodies, multiple victims, all young women, all bearing similar wounds. The black and white photos were clinical in their detail, showing angles and close-ups that spoke of professional police work. But these weren't official crime scene photos. Jake could tell from the angles and the informal notations scrawled in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. His hands trembling, Jake flipped through more folders. Each contained similar contents: photographs, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings about missing persons cases. Some of the women he recognized from old news stories that had made regional headlines. The Hillcrest Strangler, the media had called the killer. A serial murderer who had terrorized 3 counties for nearly 2 decades before simply vanishing. Jake's grandfather had been the lead investigator on several of these cases during his tenure as sheriff. But why keep unofficial files? Why hide evidence in a barn? The corkboard held the answer, and it hit Jake like a physical blow. Photographs of suspects were pinned to the board, connected by red string in a web of investigation that spoke of obsession. But it was the man in the center photograph that made Jake's legs go weak. The same square jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same stubborn cowlick that Jake saw in his own mirror every morning. His father, Thomas Morrison, age 28, according to the notation beneath the photo. Jake sank into the wooden chair, his mind reeling. His father had died when Jake was 7, killed in a construction accident that had left his mother a widow and Jake with only scattered memories of bedtime stories and weekend fishing trips. Thomas Morrison had been gentle, patient, kind, everything a father should be. But here was evidence that Marcus had suspected his own son of being a serial killer. Jake forced himself to read through the files methodically, his training as an accountant demanding order even as his world collapsed around him. The timeline was damning. Thomas had worked construction jobs that took him to all the areas where bodies had been found. He'd had access to vehicles and tools. Most disturbing of all were Marcus's private notes, documenting his son's increasingly erratic behavior, unexplained absences, and a growing coldness that had chilled the old sheriff to his bones. The final entry was dated 3 days before Thomas's death. Marcus had written in shaking handwriting, "I can't prove it, but I know. God forgive me, I know what my son has become. The question now is what to do about it." Jake's hands shook as he set the file aside. Outside, a crow cawed harshly, breaking the oppressive silence. He understood now why his grandfather had seemed so haunted in his final years, why he'd looked at Jake sometimes with a mixture of love and something that might have been fear. The legacy Jake had inherited wasn't just land and property. It was a secret that could destroy everything he'd believed about his family, about himself. And somewhere in these files might be the answer to what had really happened to Thomas Morrison. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Jake approached the barn with a crowbar he'd found in his grandfather's tool shed. Sleep had eluded him most of the night, his mind churning over the discovery of that hidden compartment. Whatever lay behind that false wall had been important enough for his grandfather to conceal it for decades. The barn door creaked open, and dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the gaps in the weathered siding. Jake made his way to the back corner where he'd made the discovery, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The loose board hung at an odd angle where he'd pried it away yesterday, revealing just a sliver of the darkness beyond. He wedged the crowbar behind another board and applied pressure. The wood groaned in protest before giving way with a sharp crack that made him flinch. One by one, he removed the planks, his hands growing steadier as the opening widened. When he had cleared enough space to squeeze through, he retrieved the flashlight from his truck and aimed its beam into the void. The hidden space was larger than he'd expected, perhaps 8 feet wide and running the entire height of the barn wall. Shelves lined both sides, sagging under the weight of boxes, mason jars, and what appeared to be ledgers wrapped in oilcloth. The air that escaped carried the scent of old paper and something else, something chemical and sharp that made his nose wrinkle. Jake squeezed through the opening and played his flashlight beam across the contents. The mason jars contained a clear liquid that caught the light like crystal. He lifted one carefully, noting how heavy it felt in his hands. The lid was sealed tight, but even through the glass he could smell the distinctive bite of moonshine. His grandfather had been running a still. The revelation should have been amusing, discovering that the stern, church-going man who'd raised him had been making illegal liquor. But as Jake examined the setup more closely, his amusement faded. This wasn't some small-time operation. The sheer volume of product stored here suggested something much more significant. He turned his attention to the ledgers, unwrapping the oilcloth with careful fingers. The leather-bound books were in remarkable condition, protected from moisture and time. He opened the top one and immediately recognized his grandfather's precise handwriting. The entries dated back to 1962. Names, dates, quantities, and dollar amounts filled page after page in neat columns. Jake recognized some of the surnames, families that still lived in the area, people he'd grown up knowing, but it was the quantities that made his breath catch. Hundreds of gallons, thousands of dollars, transactions that spanned decades. As he flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged that made his stomach clench. The operation hadn't been steady. It had ebbed and flowed with suspicious timing. Production increased dramatically during election years, around times when Jake knew the county sheriff's position had been contested. Notes in the margins referenced deliveries and special arrangements with initials he couldn't decipher. Near the back of the first ledger, a loose photograph slipped out and fluttered to the ground. Jake picked it up and aimed his flashlight at the faded color image. His grandfather stood beside a large copper still, smiling at the camera with his arm around another man. Even in the poor light, Jake recognized the second figure, Sheriff Coleman, though he looked decades younger than the man Jake remembered from his childhood. His hand shook as he turned the photograph over. In his grandfather's familiar script, Tom and Bill, summer of '78. Good partnership. Jake sank onto an overturned crate, his mind reeling. Sheriff Coleman had been in business with his grandfather. The implications crashed over him like cold water. How many other officials had been involved? How much of the county's political structure had been built on his family's illegal enterprise? He grabbed the second ledger with trembling fingers. This one covered the 1980s and early 1990s, and the entries grew more complex. References to insurance and protection appeared with increasing frequency. Some transactions were marked simply as TC, Tom Coleman, followed by substantial dollar amounts that clearly weren't payments for moonshine. Protection money. His grandfather had been paying bribes. The final entry was dated just 3 years ago, only months before his grandfather's death. The handwriting was shaky, weaker than before, but the message was clear: final payment to TC. Account settled. May God forgive us all. Jake closed the ledger and sat in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of his family's secret empire. His grandfather, the man who'd taught him about honesty and hard work, had been running an illegal operation for over 40 years. Worse, he'd been paying protection money to keep it running, corrupting law enforcement and possibly influencing elections. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him like a physical force. These weren't just family secrets. They were crimes that had shaped the entire community. And now Sheriff Coleman, who had to know Jake had inherited the farm, would certainly be wondering what else he might have inherited along with it. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Jake carried it back to the farmhouse. His hands trembled slightly as he set it on the kitchen table, the yellowed paper seeming to mock him in the afternoon light streaming through dusty windows. He'd already violated one sacred rule by opening something that wasn't meant for him. Now he had to decide whether to violate another by reading its contents. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with familiar sounds that did nothing to calm his racing thoughts. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been whether to sell the farm or try to make something of it. Now he was sitting on what felt like a time bomb, wrapped in decades-old paper and tied with string that had probably been touched by his grandfather's hands. To whoever finds this, I pray it's family, but if not, may God have mercy on us all. The opening line sent ice through Jake's veins. He set the letter aside and examined the other documents. There were photographs, their edges curled with age, showing the barn in various stages of construction. But these weren't the construction photos his grandfather had proudly displayed in the living room. These showed something else entirely, a section of the barn's foundation that looked different, deeper than it should have been. One photograph showed his grandfather as a much younger man, standing beside 2 other men Jake didn't recognize. All 3 wore grim expressions, and something about their postures suggested they weren't posing for a happy memory. Behind them, the barn's foundation yawned like an open grave. Jake's coffee grew cold as he studied each photograph, trying to piece together their significance. There were shots of concrete being poured, of his grandfather, the unknown men working by lamplight, and, most disturbing of all, what appeared to be personal belongings scattered on the ground. A woman's purse, children's toys, items that seemed oddly out of place at a barn construction site. The final photograph made Jake's stomach lurch. It showed the foundation filled and smooth, ready for the barn's frame to be erected, but knowing what lay beneath that innocent-looking concrete slab transformed the image into something sinister. His grandfather stood alone in this shot, his face gaunt with what Jake now recognized as guilt rather than exhaustion. With shaking hands, he returned to the letter. The words swam before his eyes as their meaning became clear. I thought I was helping. God knows I thought I was doing the right thing. When Earl came to me that night in '73, scared out of his mind and covered in blood, I didn't ask enough questions. I should have called the sheriff. I should have done a lot of things differently. Earl. Jake racked his memory and came up with a vague recollection of Earl Matthews, his grandfather's closest friend who'd died in the early 80s. A quiet man who'd always seemed nervous around crowds, who'd moved away from town abruptly and never returned, except for his own funeral. Said it was an accident. Said his wife had fallen down the stairs, that the baby had been hurt too, and that nobody would believe him because of his drinking. I believed him because I wanted to, because Earl was like a brother to me, and you don't abandon family. The words blurred as Jake's hands began to shake. He set the letter down and walked to the window, staring out at the barn that had dominated the landscape of his childhood. How many times had he played in that building? How many hours had he spent helping his grandfather with repairs, walking over ground that concealed something unspeakable? By the time I realized Earl had lied to me, it was too late. The concrete was poured, the barn was built, and I was an accessory to something I couldn't undo. I found out years later what really happened that night. Earl didn't just lose his temper with his wife. He'd been planning to leave town with his secretary, and his family was in the way. Jake's legs gave out, and he slumped into his grandfather's old recliner. The man who'd taught him to fish, who'd bandaged his scraped knees and told him bedtime stories, had helped cover up a double murder. The foundation of the barn, literally and figuratively, was built on the bodies of an innocent woman and child. I've carried this burden for 47 years, and it's eaten me alive from the inside. I don't expect forgiveness, not from God and certainly not from whoever reads this, but the families deserve to know what happened to Mary and little Susan Matthews. They deserve better than the lies Earl and I let the world believe. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, casting the barn in shadow. Jake realized he was crying, for his grandfather, for the victims, for the impossible choice now laid at his feet. The truth demanded justice, but justice would destroy everything his family had built on this land. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up dust as it pulled away from the farmhouse, leaving Jake standing on the porch with trembling hands. Deputy Martinez had been thorough but thankfully not suspicious, at least not yet. Jake had managed to deflect most questions about why he was renovating the barn so extensively, claiming he wanted to convert it into a workshop for furniture making. The lie came easier than he'd expected. But the deputy's parting words echoed in his mind. "We'll be keeping an eye on things out here, Jake. Your grandfather was well respected, but this area's seen some strange activity lately. People poking around old properties, asking questions about the past." Strange activity. Jake's stomach churned as he walked back toward the barn, the metal box tucked securely under his arm. Someone else was looking into the past, but whose past and why now? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Jake approached the barn doors. He'd barely slept since finding the hidden compartment, his mind racing with possibilities about what the photographs and documents might mean. The images were burned into his memory, men in suits standing around what looked like wooden crates, his grandfather among them, all of them wearing expressions that suggested they were engaged in something far from legitimate. Inside the barn, Jake set the box on his grandfather's old workbench and opened it again. The musty smell of aged paper filled his nostrils as he carefully extracted the contents. This time, he studied everything more methodically, looking for details he might have missed in his initial shock. The photographs were dated 1962, according to faded pencil marks on the backs. In the clearest image, he could make out license plates on 2 trucks parked near the barn, one from Illinois, another from Michigan. None were local. The men in the photos were strangers except for his grandfather, who looked to be in his 30s, wearing work clothes and a grim expression. Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized the chemical names from his high school chemistry classes. These weren't agricultural supplies. They were components for explosives. A handwritten ledger contained dates, amounts, and initials that meant nothing to him. But one entry stood out: Detroit delivery, $15,000, confirm with MC. $15,000 in 1962 would be worth a fortune today. What kind of farming operation generated that kind of cash? The final document was a letter, its letterhead bearing the seal of the FBI. Jake's hands shook as he read. Mr. Samuel Morrison, you are hereby notified that this bureau has opened an investigation into alleged criminal activities occurring on your property. We strongly advise your cooperation in this matter. Failure to comply may result in federal charges being filed against you and your associates. The letter was dated 3 months after the photographs were taken. But if the FBI had been investigating his grandfather, why wasn't there any record of an arrest? Jake had never heard so much as a whisper about Samuel Morrison being involved in anything illegal. A loose floorboard creaked behind him, and Jake spun around, his heart hammering. But the barn was empty, just shadows dancing in the fading light. He was getting paranoid, but maybe paranoia was justified. If someone else was sniffing around old secrets, and if those secrets were as damaging as these documents suggested, then he could be in real danger. Jake carefully photographed each document with his phone before returning everything to the metal box. He needed answers, but he also needed to be smart about how he got them. The local library might have newspaper archives from the 1960s. Old-timers in town might remember something about unusual activity at the farm. But first, he needed to secure this evidence somewhere safer than a barn that apparently multiple people knew contained hidden compartments. As he prepared to leave, Jake noticed something he'd missed earlier: fresh scratches around the edges of the compartment where he'd found the box. The metal showed bright silver against the rust, indicating recent disturbance. Someone had been here before him, possibly very recently. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't the first person to discover his grandfather's secret. Someone else knew about the hidden compartment, had possibly examined these very documents. But they'd left everything behind. Why? Maybe they'd already taken what they really wanted. Maybe the box was meant to be found. Or maybe they were watching, waiting to see what Jake would do with the information. The deputy's words came back to him, people poking around old properties, asking questions about the past. Jake was beginning to understand that inheriting this farm meant inheriting more than just land and buildings. He'd inherited a decades-old mystery that someone was determined to keep buried or expose. Either way, Jake was now caught in the middle of something that could destroy everything he thought he knew about his family. The leather journal felt heavier in Jake's hands than it should have, as if the weight of decades pressed down through its worn cover. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights staring at it, afraid to open it again, afraid of what other secrets might spill out. But the questions gnawed at him like hungry termites, eating away at everything he thought he knew about his family. Morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Jake finally cracked open the journal's spine. The pages fell naturally to where he'd left off, his grandfather's careful handwriting waiting like a confession that had been held too long. March 15th, 1983. The Johnson boy came by again today, asking questions about that night. He's persistent, I'll give him that. But some stones are better left unturned. Martha thinks we should tell him something, anything to make him stop digging. She's worried about what the neighbors are starting to whisper. Jake's coffee grew cold as he read. The Johnson boy, that had to be David Johnson, whose family used to own the property adjacent to the farm. Jake remembered his grandfather mentioning the Johnsons had moved away suddenly when Jake was young, but he'd never known why. March 22nd, 1983. Saw tire tracks by the old quarry again. Someone's been poking around where they shouldn't be. I moved the items to a safer location. The barn isn't secure enough anymore. If anyone ever finds them, God help us all. What items? Jake flipped through more pages, his pulse quickening. His grandfather's entries became increasingly paranoid, mentioning shadows in the woods, strange phone calls, the feeling of being watched. Then, abruptly, the entries stopped for nearly 6 months. When they resumed, the handwriting was shakier, older somehow. September 4th, 1983. David Johnson is dead. Car accident on Route 9, they're calling it. Drove straight into Miller's Creek in broad daylight. No skid marks, they said. No sign he even tried to brake. Martha keeps crying, says it's our fault. Maybe she's right. Maybe some prices are too high to pay. Jake's hands trembled as he turned the page. A newspaper clipping was taped To the next entry, a brief obituary for David Johnson, age 26, survived by his parents and a younger sister. The photo showed a young man with earnest eyes and a determined jawline. I keep telling myself it was an accident, had to be, but I can't shake the feeling that someone wanted him silenced, the same someone who's been calling the house, breathing into the phone before hanging up. Martha says I'm losing my mind, but I know what I know. We should have come clean from the beginning. The kitchen door creaked, and Jake slammed the journal shut, his heart hammering. But it was only the wind, pushing against the old frame. He was alone, just as he'd been for days now, wrestling with ghosts and half-truths. He opened the journal again, desperate now for answers. September 20th, 1983. Found something in the mailbox today. No postmark, no return address, just a photograph. The same photograph we thought was destroyed years ago. Someone has copies. Someone knows everything. What photograph? Jake flipped frantically through the remaining pages, but found no image. Just more cryptic entries about moving locations, changing hiding spots, the growing certainty that they were being watched. His grandfather's fear bled through every word, transforming the man Jake remembered, steady, unflappable Robert Mills, into someone desperate and haunted. The final entry was dated just 3 years ago, shortly before his grandfather's death. Jake graduates college next month. He's talking about traveling, seeing the world before settling down. Part of me hopes he never comes back here. This place, this farm, it's poisoned now. But I know he will return. It's in his blood, this connection to the land. When he does, I pray he's smart enough to leave well enough alone. Some family legacies are better buried. Jake stared at the words until they blurred. His grandfather had known, had anticipated this moment, had tried to warn him across the years. But warn him about what, exactly? What had his family done that was so terrible it had driven the Johnsons away, possibly cost David Johnson his life, and haunted his grandfather until his dying day? A sound outside made him look up, the distinct rumble of a car engine coming up the long gravel drive. Jake peered through the window and saw a silver sedan he didn't recognize pulling up to the house. A woman got out, middle-aged with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the property before settling on the house. Jake quickly stuffed the journal into the kitchen drawer and went to the front door. The woman was already climbing the porch steps, her expression grim and determined. "Jake Mills?" she asked. "Yes. My name is Carol Johnson. I think we need to talk." The surname hit him like a physical blow. Johnson. As in David Johnson, the young man who died asking too many questions. The manila envelope felt impossibly heavy in Jake's hands as he sat at his kitchen table, the contents spread before him like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. The photographs were old, their edges yellowed and corners soft with age, but the images were clear enough to make his stomach turn. His grandfather stood in several of the pictures, younger than Jake had ever known him, wearing clothes that screamed 1960s. But it wasn't Grandpa Earl that made Jake's hands shake. It was the other men in the photographs. Men in white robes and hoods, gathered around burning crosses, their faces obscured, but their intentions crystal clear. A handwritten note in spidery cursework was paper-clipped to one of the photographs. Insurance policy. Keep safe. They can never know what we did that night in 1967. M. Jake pushed back from the table, nearly knocking over his coffee mug. The initials matched his grandfather's name, Earl Morrison, the man who had taught him to fish, who had bandaged his scraped knees, who had always preached about treating people with kindness and respect, had apparently been involved with something that went against everything he claimed to believe. The burner phone buzzed against the wooden table, making Jake jump. Another text from the unknown number. "Stop digging, or you'll find more than you bargained for." This time, Jake grabbed the phone and typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Someone who knows what your family is capable of. Check your email." Jake's laptop was already open on the counter. His heart hammered as he refreshed his inbox and saw a new message from a scrambled email address. No subject line, just an attachment labeled morrison.truth.pdf. The document opened to reveal what looked like a police report, though something about it seemed off, as if it had been partially redacted or altered. The date stamp read August 15th, 1967, location, Millbrook County, 15 miles from where Jake now sat. The report detailed the investigation into the death of a civil rights worker named Marcus Washington, a young man from Chicago who had come south to register voters. Jake's eyes scanned the sparse details. Washington's body had been found in the woods, beaten and burned. The investigation had been closed within a week, officially ruled an accident despite evidence suggesting otherwise. No arrests were ever made. At the bottom of the report, a handwritten note in the margin caught Jake's attention. E. Morrison alibied by Sheriff Clayton. Case closed per orders from above. The room seemed to spin around Jake. His grandfather hadn't just been a member of some hate group. He might have been involved in murder, and worse, someone knew about it and was using that knowledge against Jake now. He thought about his parents, living peacefully in their retirement community in Florida. About his sister Sarah and her kids, blissfully unaware that their family name might be tied to one of the darkest chapters in their region's history. About his own reputation in town, already fragile as the outsider who'd inherited the Morrison farm. Another buzz from the burner phone. Now you understand. Pack up and leave town, or everyone will know what kind of family you really come from. Jake stared at the message, anger beginning to override his shock. Someone was trying to manipulate him, using his grandfather's potential crimes as leverage. But for what purpose? Why did they want him gone so badly that they'd resort to threats and blackmail? He walked to the window and peered out at the barn, its weathered walls holding secrets he was only beginning to uncover. The smart thing would be to listen to the warnings, pack his bags, and return to his old life in the city. Let someone else deal with the farm, the property, and whatever ugly truths lay buried here. But something rebellious stirred in Jake's chest. He'd never been one to back down from a challenge, and despite the horror of what he'd discovered, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. The photos and police report felt like pieces of a larger puzzle, and someone desperately wanted to prevent him from seeing the complete picture. Jake gathered the photographs and documents, sliding them back into the manila envelope. If his grandfather had been involved in Marcus Washington's death, Jake needed to know the full truth, not just the version someone was spoon-feeding him through anonymous messages and mysterious packages. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair and headed for the door. The local library would have newspaper archives from 1967, and the county clerk's office would have records from that time period. If someone wanted him to stop digging, then digging was exactly what he intended to do. The burner phone buzzed one more time as he reached his truck. Last warning, Jake. Some graves should stay buried. Jake turned off the phone and threw it into his glove compartment. He'd already come too far to turn back now. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Jake spread its contents across his kitchen table. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the documents chronologically, creating a timeline that painted an increasingly damning picture of his grandfather's activities during the war years. The first document was a land deed from 1943, showing his grandfather purchasing the farm at a price far below market value from the Kowalski family. Jake's stomach churned as he read the hasty signatures, the desperation evident in the shaky handwriting of people who had no choice but to sell. Attached was a yellowed newspaper clipping about a suspected communist sympathizer being questioned by federal authorities. Jake rubbed his eyes, trying to process what he was seeing. His grandfather had built the family's foundation on other people's misfortune, capitalizing on wartime paranoia to acquire property from families branded as unpatriotic. But the document suggested something far worse than opportunistic real estate deals. A series of receipts caught his attention, written in his grandfather's careful script, payments made to various individuals with German surnames, all dated between 1944 and 1946. The amounts were substantial, and cryptic notations in the margins referenced safe passage and new documentation. Jake's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. His grandfather hadn't just profited from wartime fear, he'd been part of an underground network, helping Nazi war criminals escape justice. The barn hadn't been storing farm equipment all these years. It had been a way station for fugitives, a hiding place where men responsible for unspeakable atrocities waited for new identities and transportation to South America. The metal box contained payment records, code names, and routes that had operated right under the noses of federal investigators. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. "Having second thoughts about our conversation. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. A concerned neighbor." He looked out his kitchen window toward the Hartley property, but couldn't see anyone watching. The message felt like a warning, though he couldn't tell if it was meant to protect him or threaten him. Either way, someone else knew about the documents, and they were monitoring his movements. A knock at the front door made him jump. Jake quickly gathered the papers, shoving them back into the envelope and sliding it under a stack of farm magazines. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the door, half expecting to find federal agents or worse on his doorstep. Instead, he found Sarah Chen, the local librarian who'd helped him research the farm's history. Her usually cheerful demeanor was replaced by obvious anxiety, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if checking whether she'd been followed. "Sarah? What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you about what you found," she said, stepping inside before he could invite her. "And before you ask how I know, this is a small town. Word travels fast when someone starts digging into old records." Jake led her to the living room, grateful he'd hidden the documents in the kitchen. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Please don't lie to me, Jake. I've been the librarian here for 15 years. I know which families have secrets they'd rather keep buried, and I know your grandfather's reputation wasn't as clean as people pretended." She sat on the edge of his couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What I'm about to tell you could get us both in serious trouble. Sarah, 3 years ago, a man came to the library asking about property records from the 1940s. Foreign accent, expensive suit, very polite but persistent. He was particularly interested in your grandfather's farm and any documentation about previous owners." Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "He left his business card. He was a Nazi hunter, Jake, working with the Simon Wiesenthal Center." The room felt like it was spinning. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I couldn't access the sealed records he wanted without a court order, but he said he'd be back and that your family might be contacted eventually." She pulled a worn business card from her purse. "He died in a car accident 2 weeks later. Local police said it was weather-related, but the timing felt suspicious." Jake stared at the business card, reading the name Dr. Klaus Brenner printed in simple black letters. Below it was a phone number and the center's logo. The card's edges were worn, as if Sarah had handled it many times over the past 3 years. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because yesterday someone else came asking the same questions, and this time they weren't as polite." Sarah stood abruptly, moving toward the window to peer through the curtains. "Jake, whatever you found in that barn, there are people who will kill to keep it secret. Dr. Brenner might have been the first victim, but he won't be the last." The weight of decades-old sins pressed down on Jake's shoulders as he realized his grandfather's legacy had trapped him in a web of violence that stretched across continents and generations. The old newspaper clippings scattered across the kitchen table told a story Jake wished he'd never uncovered. His hands trembled as he smoothed out the yellowed pages, each headline more damning than the last. "Local family missing. Search continues for Henderson children. No leads in disappearance case." The dates matched perfectly with what he'd found in the barn. September 1987. 3 children, ages 6 to 12, vanished without a trace while walking home from school. The photos showed smiling faces that would haunt Jake's dreams: Sarah, Michael, and little Tommy Henderson. Jake's phone buzzed against the wooden surface. Marcus again. He'd been calling all morning, but Jake couldn't bring himself to answer. "How do you tell your best friend that your grandfather might have been a monster?" The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway made Jake's blood freeze. Through the kitchen window, he watched Sheriff Morrison's patrol car roll to a stop. The lawman stepped out slowly, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his hat. Jake quickly gathered the newspaper clippings, shoving them into a kitchen drawer just as Morrison's boots echoed on the front porch. 3 sharp knocks followed. "Jake, it's Sheriff Morrison. Need to have a word with you." Opening the door felt like signing his own death warrant, but running would only make things worse. Morrison stood on the threshold, his pale blue eyes scanning Jake's face with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades reading guilt. "Sheriff, what can I do for you? Mind if I come in? Got some questions about your grandfather's property." Jake's mouth went dry, but he stepped aside. Morrison entered with the confident stride of someone who belonged wherever he chose to go. His gaze swept the kitchen, lingering on the drawer where Jake had hidden the clippings. "Funny thing happened yesterday," Morrison said, settling into a chair without invitation. "Got a call from Mrs. Henley down the road. Says she's been hearing machinery running on your property late at night. Digging sounds. I've been doing some cleanup work in the barn," Jake managed. "Lots of old junk to clear out." Morrison nodded slowly. "That so? Your grandfather was quite the collector, wasn't he? Kept all sorts of interesting things in that barn over the years." The way he said interesting made Jake's skin crawl. Did Morrison know something? Had he always known? "Sheriff, is there something specific you wanted to ask me?" Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with predatory patience. "Tell me, son, did your grandfather ever mention the Henderson family to you?" Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. "No, sir. Should he have?" "Maybe. Maybe not." Morrison's hand rested casually on his service weapon. "See, that case never sat right with me. 3 kids don't just vanish into thin air. Someone had to know something." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Jake forced himself to maintain eye contact, knowing that looking away would be as good as a confession. "I wouldn't know anything about that, Sheriff. I was just a kid myself back then." "True enough." Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "But sometimes the sins of one generation have a way of catching up with the next." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Jake, if you happen to find anything unusual while you're cleaning out that barn, you give me a call, day or night. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep." After Morrison left, Jake slumped against the closed door, his legs barely supporting him. The sheriff knew, maybe not everything, but enough to be watching, waiting for Jake to make a mistake. He retrieved the newspaper clippings from the drawer, spreading them out again. The Henderson children's faces stared back at him, frozen in time. Whatever his grandfather had done, those families deserved answers. But giving them the truth would destroy everything: his family's name, his future, possibly his freedom. The sound of another vehicle approaching sent Jake scrambling to hide the evidence again. This time it was Marcus's pickup truck. His friend climbed out wearing a concerned expression and carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've been avoiding my calls," Marcus said as Jake reluctantly let him in. "What's going on? You look like hell." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, needing something to warm the ice in his veins. Just stressed about the farm. Lots to figure out. Marcus wasn't buying it. "This is about whatever you found in that barn, isn't it? Jake, talk to me. We've been friends since grade school. Whatever it is, we can handle it." Looking at Marcus's earnest face, Jake felt the weight of his terrible knowledge pressing down like a physical force. He wanted desperately to confide in someone, to share the burden that was slowly crushing him. But Marcus was a good man, an honest man. How could Jake drag him into this nightmare? "I wish I could, Marcus. I really do. But some things—" Jake's voice trailed off as he stared out the window toward the barn. "Some things are better left buried." The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Jake spread its contents across his kitchen table. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the photographs, documents, and yellowed newspaper clippings that his grandfather had hidden away for decades. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across the evidence of secrets that should have died with Henry. The first photograph stopped him cold, black and white, slightly blurred but unmistakably showing his grandfather standing beside a man Jake recognized from old family stories. Vincent Torino, a name whispered in hushed tones whenever the adults thought the children weren't listening. The notorious bootlegger who had disappeared without a trace in 1953. Jake's coffee grew cold as he studied each image. There were dozens of them. Trucks arriving at the farm under cover of darkness, men unloading wooden crates, handshakes and exchanges of what looked like substantial amounts of cash. His grandfather wasn't just a witness to Torino's operation, he was a partner. A folded newspaper clipping caught his attention. The headline read, "Bootlegger Vincent Torino vanishes. Police suspect foul play." The article was dated 3 days after the last photograph in the collection. Jake's stomach churned as he read the details. Torino had been scheduled to meet with federal agents, apparently ready to turn state's evidence against his associates. He never made it to that meeting. Underneath the clipping, Jake found a handwritten note in his grandfather's careful script. "Some debts can only be paid one way. God forgive me." The paper was stained with something dark that looked suspiciously like blood. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway made Jake's heart leap into his throat. He quickly gathered the evidence, shoving it back into the envelope as headlights swept across his kitchen window. Through the glass, he saw a familiar pickup truck. Tom Bradley, his grandfather's old friend, and the one person who might have answers to the questions burning in Jake's mind. Tom knocked softly before entering, his weathered face grave in the porch light. "Evening, Jake. Saw your lights on late. Everything all right?" Jake studied the older man's expression, searching for any sign that Tom knew about the envelope's contents. "Just going through some of Grandpa's old things. You know how it is." "I do indeed." Tom's eyes flicked to the manila envelope on the table. "Some things from the past are better left alone, son. Your grandfather was a good man who did what he had to do during difficult times." The careful way Tom spoke sent a chill down Jake's spine. "What kind of difficult times?" Tom pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. The kind where good people sometimes have to make impossible choices. Your grandfather never meant for any of it to happen the way it did. Any of what? Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. Vincent Torino was bleeding money and desperate. He'd been skimming from his own operation, and when his partners found out, Tom shook his head. He came to Henry begging for help, said he'd make it worth his while if Henry would just let him use the barn for a few months until things cooled down. Jake felt the walls of the kitchen closing in around him. "And Grandpa agreed?" "Your family was struggling. The farm was barely keeping food on the table. Henry thought it would be easy money for a few months of looking the other way." Tom's voice carried decades of regret, but Torino got greedy, started bringing more attention than either of them bargained for. When word got out that he was planning to talk to the feds, what happened to him? Tom was quiet for a long moment, his gnarled hands folded on the table. Torino's partners came looking for him one night. Henry tried to warn him, but it was too late. They found him hiding in the barn. Jake's mouth went dry. "They killed him there?" Henry said it happened so fast. One minute they were talking, the next. Tom gestured helplessly. "Your grandfather spent the rest of his life carrying that guilt. He never touched a dime of Torino's money after that night." "Where is he buried?" "You have to understand," Tom said finally. "Your grandfather was protecting his family. If word had gotten out about his involvement with Torino, it would have destroyed everything he'd worked for. The farm, your grandmother's reputation, your father's future, all of it." Jake stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of 3 generations of secrets pressing down on him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because others know about that barn, Jake. People who've been waiting a long time for Henry to die so they could come looking." Tom's eyes were deadly serious. "And now they know you're here alone." As if summoned by his words, the sound of car engines rumbled in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. The headlights cut through the darkness as Jake pulled into the farmhouse driveway, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The manila envelope containing the photograph sat on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon, its contents threatening to detonate everything he thought he knew about his family. Inside the house, he spread the black and white photographs across the kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. Each image told a piece of the story he'd been desperately trying to avoid. His grandfather, young and stern-faced, standing beside men in expensive suits. Handshakes with individuals whose faces Jake recognized from old newspaper clippings about organized crime. Money changing hands in shadowy corners of what looked like the very barn where he'd found the hidden room. The final photograph stopped his breath entirely. His grandfather, smiling, arm draped around the shoulders of Vincent the Viper Castellano, a notorious crime boss who disappeared in 1952. The same year, Jake realized with growing horror that his grandfather had suddenly acquired enough money to expand the farm and modernize the entire operation. A soft knock at the front door made him jump. He quickly gathered the photographs, shoving them back into the envelope as footsteps approached. Through the window, he glimpsed Sarah's familiar silhouette. "Jake, I saw your lights on. Are you okay?" Her voice carried genuine concern. He opened the door, trying to arrange his features into something resembling normalcy. "Just couldn't sleep. You know how it is." Sarah studied his face in the porch light. "You look terrible. What's wrong?" "Don't lie to me." She pushed past him into the house. "Ever since you found that room, you've been acting like someone's hunting you. What did you discover?" Jake closed the door, his mind racing. Sarah had been nothing but helpful, but trust felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Too many people already knew about the hidden room, and each revelation seemed to put him in greater danger. "Family documents," he said carefully. "Old business records. Nothing dramatic." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Family documents don't usually require multiple trips to county archives and meetings with elderly farmers." She gestured toward the kitchen table where he'd left a corner of the envelope visible. "And they don't usually come in manila packages that make you look like you've seen a ghost." Before he could stop her, Sarah moved toward the table. Jake lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. "Don't." The word came out sharper than he intended. Sarah stared at him, and for a moment he saw something flicker across her expression. Hurt? Or something else entirely? "You don't trust me," she said quietly. "It's not that simple. It never is with secrets." Sarah pulled her wrist free. "My grandmother always said secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. The longer you hold on to them, the more toxic they become." Jake wanted to tell her everything. The photographs, the connection to the Castellano family, the growing certainty that his grandfather had been involved in something far darker than he'd ever imagined. But the weight of the danger pressed down on him like a physical force. "Some secrets protect people," he said finally. "And some secrets get people killed." The bluntness of her statement sent a chill down his spine. "What do you mean?" Sarah moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "This is a small town, Jake. Word travels fast. People are starting to talk about the changes at your farm, about you asking questions, poking around in old business." She turned back to face him. "There are families around here with long memories. Some of them might not appreciate having old stones turned over." "What families?" "The Martinellis, for one. They've owned the construction company for 3 generations, but there are rumors about how they really made their money back in the day. The Costellos run the trucking business, but their roots have always been unusual." Sarah's voice dropped lower. "And then there's my own family." Jake felt the floor seem to shift beneath him. "Your family?" "My great-uncle Tony disappeared in 1952. Same time a lot of people in this area either got very quiet or got very gone." She met his eyes directly. "I've been wondering if whatever you found might explain what happened to him." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Jake realized he'd been naive to think he could handle this alone. Naive to believe the past would stay buried simply because he wished it would. "If I show you something," he said slowly, "there's no going back. Once you know, you're part of it." Sarah nodded without hesitation. "I've been part of it my whole life, Jake. I just didn't know it yet." Jake retrieved the envelope from where he'd hidden it behind the sugar canister. As he spread the photographs across the table once again, he watched Sarah's face carefully, searching for any sign that his trust was misplaced. Her sharp intake of breath when she saw the final photograph told him everything he needed to know. "That's Uncle Tony," she whispered, pointing to a figure in the background. "He's alive in this picture." The sheriff's cruiser disappeared down the gravel drive, leaving Jake standing alone in the gathering dusk. Deputy Martinez had been thorough but professional, asking pointed questions about the barn fire and Jake's whereabouts that evening. Jake had stuck to his story. He'd been in town having dinner at Murphy's Diner, then returned to find the barn engulfed in flames. What he hadn't mentioned was the manila envelope, now hidden beneath his mattress upstairs, rescued from the flames just minutes before the fire department arrived. The photographs and documents inside painted a picture so damning that Jake understood why someone would kill to keep them buried. His phone buzzed. "Sarah, are you okay? I heard about the fire on the scanner at work." "I'm fine. The barn's gone, but the house is safe." Jake walked toward the porch, his boots crunching on frost-covered grass. "Can you come over? I need to show you something." "I'll be there in 20 minutes." Jake used the time to study the contents of the envelope more carefully. The photographs were from 1987, showing his grandfather, Harold, meeting with a man Jake didn't recognize. They appeared to be exchanging briefcases beside what looked like the old grain silo. But it was the documents that made Jake's blood run cold, shipping manifests, payment records and correspondence that clearly outlined a money laundering operation. Harold Morrison, the pillar of the community, had been washing dirty money through the farm for years. Sarah's headlights swept across the living room windows as she pulled into the driveway. Jake quickly returned everything to the envelope and met her at the door. "Jesus, Jake, you look terrible." She pulled him into a hug, and he realized how much he'd needed that human contact. "What happened?" "Someone tried to burn down the barn to destroy evidence, but they didn't get everything." He led her to the kitchen table and spread out the contents of the envelope. "Sarah, my grandfather wasn't who I thought he was." She studied the photographs first, then the documents. Her face grew pale as she read. "This is from the Castellano investigation. I remember hearing my dad talk about it when I was a kid. The FBI spent years trying to prove the family was laundering money through legitimate businesses in the area, but they could never make anything stick. Because they were using farms like this one," Jake said grimly. "Look at these payment amounts." Harold was receiving tens of thousands of dollars for what's listed as grain storage fees, but the farm's books show no corresponding income. Sarah picked up one of the photographs, examining it closely. "Jake, do you recognize this man meeting with your grandfather?" He looked again. The man was tall, well-dressed, with distinctive silver hair. "No, should I?" Jake felt the walls of his world shifting. So someone found out about this and killed Carol Hendricks to keep her quiet. Then they killed Thomas Brennan when he got too close to the truth. And now they're trying to eliminate any remaining evidence, Sarah added. "Jake, you need to turn this over to the FBI. What if there are more people involved? What if whoever's behind this has connections in law enforcement?" Jake stood and paced to the window, paranoia creeping in like fog. Thomas trusted the wrong person, and it got him killed. Sarah joined him at the window. "Then we need to be smarter about this. My contact at the Tribune has connections with federal investigators, people she trusts." A sound from outside made them both freeze, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, barely audible but definitely there. Jake killed the kitchen lights and peered through the curtain. A dark figure was moving between the trees at the edge of the property. "Back door," he whispered, grabbing the envelope and Sarah's hand. They slipped out through the rear of the house and crept toward Sarah's car. The footsteps were circling toward the front now, and Jake could see the faint beam of a flashlight through the living room windows. Sarah started her car as quietly as possible and backed down the driveway without headlights until they reached the main road. Only then did Jake allow himself to breathe. "Your place?" he asked. "No, too obvious. I know somewhere safe." As they drove through the darkness, Jake clutched the envelope tighter. 3 people were already dead because of these secrets, and now he and Sarah were targets too. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Jake felt a spark of determination replacing the fear. His grandfather's sins didn't have to define him. He could choose to do what Harold never had the courage to do. Tell the truth no matter the cost. The question was whether they'd live long enough to expose it. The rain hammered against the kitchen windows as Jake stared at the photographs spread across the wooden table. Each black and white image told a piece of the story he'd been desperately trying to avoid. His grandfather's involvement with the missing Hartwell family from 1962. Margaret sat across from him, her weathered hands clasped tightly together, while Sheriff Coleman paced near the door like a caged animal. "There's more," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Things I never told anyone, not even your grandmother." Jake's stomach clenched. Every revelation had been worse than the last, and he wasn't sure he could handle another bombshell. But the truth had momentum now, rolling downhill like a boulder, crushing everything in its path. "The night they disappeared," Margaret continued, "I saw your grandfather loading something heavy into his truck. It was past midnight, and he thought everyone was asleep, but I'd been up with a sick calf." Coleman stopped pacing. "What kind of something?" "Wrapped in canvas. About the size of—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Jake felt the room spinning slightly. "You think he killed them?" "I don't know what to think anymore." Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. "Your grandfather was a good man, Jake, but he was also protecting something, someone." The sheriff moved closer to the table, studying the photographs with renewed intensity. "These pictures, where exactly did you find them?" "Hidden compartment in the barn," Jake replied, "along with some documents and newspaper clippings about the Hartwell disappearance. I need to see that compartment. Tonight." Jake glanced toward the window, where lightning illuminated the torrential downpour. "In this weather, especially in this weather. If there's evidence out there, I want it secured before anyone else comes looking for it." The words sent a chill through Jake. "Anyone else?" Coleman's expression grew grim. "You think you're the only one interested in this old case? Marcus Hartwell's been asking questions around town. Lots of questions, and he's not the only one." Jake remembered the threatening phone calls, the feeling of being watched, the break-in that had left his house searched but nothing apparently stolen. Someone else was definitely looking for answers, or trying to make sure those answers stayed buried. "We should wait until morning," Margaret said. "It's not safe in this storm." But Jake was already reaching for his jacket. Something in Coleman's urgency told him they couldn't afford to wait. "Let's go." Inside the barn, Coleman examined the hidden compartment with a professional eye, while Jake held a flashlight steady. The sheriff photographed everything before carefully removing the remaining documents and artifacts. "Your grandfather was methodical," Coleman observed. "These records go back decades. Property transfers, financial transactions, correspondence with lawyers." "What kind of correspondence?" Jake asked. Coleman held up a letter dated 3 months after the Hartwell disappearance. "Looks like he was trying to buy their land, through intermediaries." "He bought their land," Jake said slowly, "after they vanished. At a fraction of its value," Coleman confirmed. "That's how he saved this farm, Jake, the money from developing the Hartwell property." Margaret leaned against a wooden post, looking older than her 78 years. "He never talked about where the money came from, just said we'd gotten lucky with some investments." A sudden noise from outside made them all freeze. Coleman immediately switched off his flashlight and motioned for silence. Through the rain, Jake could hear the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching. "Back door," Jake whispered, remembering the rear exit his grandfather had installed years ago. But as they moved toward the back of the barn, they heard car doors slamming, multiple vehicles, multiple people. Coleman drew his weapon, his face tense in the dim light. "How many people know about this place?" he asked quietly. "Just us," Jake replied. But even as he said it, he realized how naive that sounded. The secret had been hidden for 60 years, but now that it was exposed, others would inevitably be drawn to it like moths to flame. Voices carried on the wind, men's voices, urgent and purposeful. Someone shouted instructions, though the words were lost in the storm. Jake's heart pounded as he realized they were trapped. Whatever his grandfather had done all those years ago, whatever secrets lay buried on this property, someone was willing to brave a dangerous storm to claim them. The past had finally caught up with the present, and there was nowhere left to run. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Jake's feet as he descended into the grey morning light. The manila envelope clutched in his trembling hands contained copies of every document he'd found in the barn: birth certificates, death records, newspaper clippings, and his grandfather's meticulous notes. The weight of truth pressed against his chest like a physical force. Margaret's car idled at the curb, exhaust visible in the crisp air. She'd insisted on driving him to the police station, though her face had gone ashen when he'd called that morning. The family matriarch who'd weathered every storm suddenly looked every one of her 83 years. "You sure about this, Jake?" Her voice wavered as he slid into the passenger seat. "Once you hand those over, there's no taking it back. The Brennan name will be mud in this town." Jake stared through the windshield at the familiar Main Street storefronts. 3 families lost children, Aunt Margaret. 3 families spent decades wondering what happened to them. Don't they deserve to know? The truth should have come out in 1976. They drove in silence past the diner, where Jake had shared countless meals with his grandfather, past the hardware store where old-timers still gathered to swap stories. Soon those stories would include whispered conversations about the Brennan family and what they'd hidden in their barn. Detective Morrison was waiting when they arrived at the station. Jake had called ahead, explaining only that he had information about several missing persons cases from the 1970s. Morrison's weathered face betrayed nothing as he led them to a small conference room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. "I appreciate you coming forward, Mr. Brennan." Morrison activated a digital recorder and placed it between them. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" Jake's throat felt like sandpaper. "My grandfather, Thomas Brennan, witnessed 3 murders in October 1976. He never reported them because the killer threatened to frame him for the crimes." Morrison leaned forward. "What murders?" "Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, and David Rodriguez. They were all reported as runaways, but they were killed by someone my grandfather knew." Jake slid the envelope across the table. He documented everything: photos, witness statements he never filed, even hair samples he collected from the crime scenes. The detective's eyebrows rose as he extracted the contents. His expression grew increasingly grave as he examined each piece of evidence. "This is substantial. Why didn't your grandfather come forward after the suspect died?" "Because the suspect didn't die alone." Jake's voice cracked. "My grandfather helped cover up the murders, not willingly, but his fingerprints were on evidence. His truck was used to transport one of the bodies. He was in too deep by then." Margaret placed a weathered hand on Jake's arm. "Show him the photographs." Morrison studied the black and white images with practiced eyes. "These show your grandfather at what appears to be a burial site." 3 sites, Jake corrected. "The killer made him help dig the graves. Grandfather marked the locations on that map there. GPS coordinates based on current landmarks." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Morrison methodically reviewed each document, occasionally making notes on a yellow pad. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Brennan, you understand this evidence implicates your grandfather as an accessory to multiple homicides?" "I understand." Jake's voice was steady now. "But it also gives 3 families the closure they've been waiting for, and it identifies the real killer." Morrison flipped through the pages until he found Thomas Brennan's handwritten confession. His eyes widened as he read the name at the bottom. Judge Patterson. Harold Patterson. "He wasn't a judge then," Jake said. "Just a prosecutor with political ambitions. The victims had information about corruption in the district attorney's office. Patterson silenced them, then used my grandfather's involvement to ensure his compliance." Margaret's laugh was bitter. Institutions built on foundations of murder tend to crumble eventually. Morrison gathered the documents and stood. I'll need to verify these claims, but if authentic, this will trigger multiple investigations. The Patterson family still has considerable influence. You may face retaliation. Jake thought about the threatening phone calls, the break-in at the farm, the black sedan that had followed him twice this week. I think that's already started. We'll provide protection, if necessary. Morrison paused at the door. For what it's worth, coming forward took courage. Your grandfather would be proud. As they left the station, Jake felt simultaneously lighter and more vulnerable than he'd ever been. The secret was out, but the real danger was just beginning. The headlights swept across the gravel driveway as Jake pulled up to the farmhouse, his hands still trembling from the confrontation at the warehouse. The manila envelope containing the photographs sat heavy on the passenger seat, evidence that could finally expose the truth about what his grandfather had done all those years ago. But as he stepped out of the truck, something felt wrong. The front door hung slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the gap. Jake always locked that door. Always. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves that carpeted the porch. The familiar creak of the third floorboard seemed deafening in the stillness. When he pushed the door open, the smell hit him immediately. Cigarette smoke and something else. Something metallic that made his stomach clench. "Hello, Jake." The voice came from the shadows of the living room, calm and measured. A figure stepped into the moonlight streaming through the window, and Jake's blood turned to ice. Uncle Carl sat in grandfather's old recliner, a cigarette dangling from his lips and a pistol resting casually across his knee. His weathered face bore the same hard expression Jake remembered from childhood, but now it carried something darker, desperation tinged with resignation. "You couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Carl took a long drag, the ember glowing red in the darkness. 43 years I've kept this family's secret buried, and you had to go digging it up like some damn archaeologist." Jake's mind raced, calculating distances to the door, to the phone, to anything that might serve as a weapon. "How long have you known I found the room?" "Since the day you moved in." Carl's laugh was bitter. "You think I didn't notice the fresh scratches on that barn door? The way you started asking questions around town? I've been watching, waiting to see what you'd do with what you found. Your grandfather didn't kill anyone, you stupid boy." Carl stood slowly, the gun never wavering. "I did. Every last one of them. Heinrich was just the middleman, helping people disappear who needed to disappear. Some were running from the law, others from debts they couldn't pay, but some—" His voice hardened. "Some were running from justice they deserved." Jake felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "You're saying grandfather was helping people?" "In his own twisted way, yes. Until I found out what kind of people some of them really were." Carl moved closer, and Jake could see the years of guilt etched in the lines around his eyes. "One of them was a man named Fletcher. Came through in '79, said he needed to start over. Your grandfather set him up with new papers, just like always. Except Fletcher had been molesting kids back in Ohio. I found out by accident when I overheard him talking to another man about his preferences." The room felt suffocating. Jake's grandfather hadn't been a killer. He'd been trying to help people, even if his methods were illegal. But Carl— "So you appointed yourself judge and jury?" "Someone had to." Carl's voice cracked slightly. "I couldn't let men like that disappear into new lives where they could hurt more children. I started checking backgrounds, investigating the people Heinrich helped. The ones who deserved what they were running from. Well, they never made it to their new lives." Jake thought of the IDs in the wooden box, each one representing a person who'd trusted his grandfather for help, and instead found death at his uncle's hands. "How many?" 17 over 8 years, and I'd do it again." Carl raised the gun, pointing it directly at Jake's chest. "Your grandfather never knew. I made sure the bodies were never found, made it look like they'd simply moved on. He died thinking he'd helped all those people start over, but you kept the IDs, the photographs. Insurance. In case anyone ever came looking." Carl's finger moved to the trigger. I never thought it would be family who'd dig it all up. Jake's hand slowly moved toward his jacket pocket. The people you killed, they weren't all bad. I saw their files, Carl. Some were just desperate people trying to escape poverty or failed marriages. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Carl's eyes. You don't know what you're talking about. Margaret Santos, age 26. She was running from an abusive husband who'd broken her ribs twice. Jake pulled out one of the photographs, holding it up. Thomas Chen, 19 years old. His parents disowned him for being gay, and he was living on the streets. Carl's hand began to shake. No, I checked. I always checked. You checked wrong. Jake took a step forward. You murdered innocent people, Carl. And now you're going to kill me to cover it up? The gun wavered in Carl's grip as 43 years of certainty crumbled around him. The emergency room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jake sat beside Elena's hospital bed, her hand still warm in his, despite the 4 tubes snaking up her arm. The doctor had assured him the sedative would wear off soon, but watching her unconscious face only amplified his guilt. She'd been dragged into his family's nightmare because he'd been too stubborn to walk away when he should have. His phone buzzed for the 20th time. Detective Morrison again. Jake had been dodging her calls since arriving at the hospital, but he knew he couldn't avoid her much longer. The truth was, he didn't know what to tell her anymore. Everything he thought he understood about his grandfather had crumbled in that barn. Elena's fingers twitched and her eyes fluttered open. Jake? Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm here. He squeezed her hand gently. How do you feel? She tried to sit up, wincing. Like I've been hit by a truck. What happened after I... Don't worry about that right now. You need to rest. But Elena's journalistic instincts were already kicking in, even through the haze of medication. The documents, did you find them? The ones your grandfather hid? Jake's jaw tightened. After Elena had collapsed, he'd torn through every inch of that hidden room. Behind a loose board, he'd found a metal box containing photographs, letters, and records that painted a picture he wished he could unsee. His grandfather hadn't just been hiding stolen artifacts. He'd been part of something much larger and more sinister. I found them. He couldn't meet her eyes. Elena, there are things about my family that I never knew. Things that go back generations. The door creaked open, and Detective Morrison stepped inside, her expression grim. Mr. Matthews, we need to talk. Now. Jake stood slowly, his legs stiff from hours in the uncomfortable chair. Can't this wait? Elena just woke up. 3 more bodies were discovered on your property this morning. Morrison's words hit him like a physical blow. The ground-penetrating radar found them buried near the old well. This isn't just about your grandfather anymore, Jake. This is about a pattern that goes back decades. Elena struggled to sit up straighter, her reporter's instincts overriding her physical discomfort. What kind of pattern? Morrison glanced between them, then seemed to make a decision. We've been tracking missing persons cases in this area, going back to the 1940s, people who disappeared without a trace, mostly transients, immigrants, people who wouldn't be missed. The soil analysis suggests these bodies have been there for different periods of time. Jake felt the walls closing in around him. The documents he'd found painted a similar picture, records of people who'd sought work at the farm, payment schedules that abruptly stopped, notes in his grandfather's handwriting that made his stomach turn. But there had been other handwriting too, other signatures. His great-grandfather's. His great-great-grandfather's. My family's been covering this up for generations, Jake said quietly, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. It wasn't just my grandfather, it was all of them. Morrison pulled out a worn photograph from her jacket pocket. We found this in your grandfather's safe deposit box. The bank turned it over with his papers. Jake stared at the black and white image. 3 men stood in front of the barn, smiling at the camera. He recognized his grandfather as a young man, but the other 2 faces were unfamiliar. On the back, someone had written, The Order of Silent Fields, Protecting What Matters, 1962. The Order of Silent Fields? Elena's voice was stronger now, her investigative mind working despite her condition. That sounds like an organization. It was. Morrison's expression was grave. We've found references to it in old police files, always connected to missing persons cases in rural areas across 3 counties. Your family farm appears to have been one of their primary disposal sites. Jake sank back into his chair, the weight of generations of secrets crushing down on him. I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea. I believe you, Morrison said. But Jake, there's more. The toxicology report on your grandfather came back. He didn't die of natural causes. Someone poisoned him. The room spun around Jake. Poisoned. But who would? Someone who knew what he was hiding. Someone who wanted to make sure he took his secrets to the grave. Morrison leaned forward. The question is, did they succeed, or did they know you'd eventually find what was hidden in that barn? Elena reached for Jake's hand again, her grip surprisingly strong. Jake, you need to get away from that farm, tonight. If someone killed your grandfather to protect these secrets, and now you know them too. The implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake looked between the 2 women, seeing his own fear reflected in their faces. Somewhere out there, members of the Order of Silent Fields might still be alive, still protecting their decades-old conspiracy. And now Jake had made himself their newest target. The sheriff's cruiser pulled into the driveway just as Jake finished burying the last of the evidence behind the old oak tree. His hands were still dirty, dirt caked under his fingernails, but there was no time to clean up. Through the kitchen window, he watched Sheriff Morrison step out of the car, his weathered face grim in the morning light. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he walked to the front door. 3 days had passed since he'd confronted his uncle about the bodies in the barn, since Tom had broken down and confessed to covering up their grandfather's crimes for 40 years. 3 days since they'd made the decision to move the remains and destroy any evidence that could implicate the family. Of course. Jake stepped aside, fighting to keep his voice steady. Coffee? That'd be good. Morrison followed him into the kitchen, his boots heavy on the worn linoleum. Had an interesting conversation with a fellow from the State Historical Society yesterday. Seems someone's been asking questions about missing persons from the 1970s and 80s, specifically folks who might have had dealings with farms in this area. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he poured the coffee. That so? Morrison accepted the mug, studying Jake's face. You know anything about that? Can't say I do. Jake sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where his grandfather had eaten breakfast every morning for decades, where he'd planned God knows what other horrors. Why would I? The lie came easier than Jake expected. I've been looking into genealogy stuff since I inherited the place, trying to understand the family history better. Nothing about missing persons. Funny thing about family history, Morrison said, his grey eyes never leaving Jake's face. Sometimes it's not what we expect to find. A bead of sweat rolled down Jake's spine. Through the window he could see the freshly turned earth near the oak tree. From here it looked like he'd been gardening, but Morrison was a smart man. Too smart. I found some old documents in the barn, Jake said, deciding to offer just enough truth to seem cooperative. Letters, financial records, that kind of thing. Nothing that seemed important. Mind if I take a look at that barn? The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake knew he couldn't refuse without raising more suspicion, but the barn still held traces of what had happened there. Despite their careful cleaning, blood had a way of lingering in old wood. Sure, Jake said, though I should warn you, it's pretty much empty now. I've been clearing it out. They walked across the yard together, Morrison's eyes taking in everything. The disturbed ground, the burn pile where Jake had destroyed his grandfather's journals, the way Jake's hands shook slightly as he unlocked the barn door. Inside, the space felt cavernous and hollow. Jake had spent 2 full days scrubbing every surface, replacing several floorboards. even repainting sections of the walls. But standing here with Morrison, he could swear the smell of death still lingered. Morrison walked slowly through the space, his footsteps echoing. He stopped at the spot where Jake had found the first body, crouching down to examine the newer floorboards. "Recent work," he observed. "Some of the old boards were rotting," Jake said. "Figured I should fix them before they became a safety hazard." Morrison stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Your Uncle Tom been helping you with this cleanup?" The question felt like a trap. "Some. He's been coming by to share stories about Grandpa, help me understand what kind of man he was." "And what kind of man was he?" Jake met Morrison's gaze directly. The kind who worked hard, kept to himself, and did what he thought was necessary to protect his family. Something shifted in Morrison's expression, a flicker of understanding, maybe even sympathy. He'd known Jake's grandfather for years, had probably suspected things weren't quite right at the old farm. "Jake," Morrison said quietly, "sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us, and sometimes it's better to face it head-on rather than let it fester. I appreciate that, Sheriff, but I'm not sure what you're getting at." Morrison nodded slowly, as if reaching some internal decision. "I'm going to tell that historical society fellow that I looked into things and didn't find anything worth pursuing. Sometimes old mysteries are better left alone, especially when the only people who might get hurt are the innocent ones left behind." Jake's knees nearly buckled with relief, but he forced himself to remain steady. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Morrison said, heading for the door. "Just make sure whatever needed burying stays buried. Some secrets are too dangerous to dig up." The shovel bit into the earth with a satisfying crunch, each strike echoing off the barn walls like a funeral dirge. Jake wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead as he continued his grim work. The hole was nearly deep enough now, deep enough to bury the last remnants of his grandfather's sins. Sheriff Morrison's body lay wrapped in an old tarp beside the freshly dug grave, blood seeping through the fabric where Jake's desperate blow had connected with the man's skull. Self-defense, Jake told himself for the 100th time. Morrison had come to kill him, to silence the only person who knew about the human trafficking ring that had operated from this very barn for decades. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was burying a corrupt lawman in the same spot where his grandfather had once hidden the evidence of his own crimes. The skeletal remains Jake had discovered weeks ago were now carefully reinterred in wooden boxes, finally given the dignity they deserved. But Morrison would get no such respect. Jake's phone buzzed against his leg. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and his heart clenched. He'd been avoiding her calls since yesterday, unable to face the woman he loved while blood stained his hands. How could he explain that he'd become everything he'd once despised about his family legacy? "Jake? Thank God you answered." Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker, tinged with worry. "I've been trying to reach you. There are FBI agents at the diner asking questions about Morrison. They say he's missing." Jake's blood turned to ice. "What kind of questions?" "About his connection to your grandfather, about whether anyone's seen him recently." "Jake, they seem to think he was involved in something big, something that connects to your farm." The shovel slipped from Jake's trembling fingers. Of course the FBI would be investigating. Morrison's disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed, especially if they were already tracking his criminal activities. Jake had been naive to think he could simply make the sheriff vanish without consequences. "Jake, are you there?" "I'm here," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. "There's something else." They found Morrison's car abandoned near Miller's Creek, about 10 miles from your place. They're organizing search parties. The phone slipped from Jake's grip, clattering onto the barn floor. Search parties. They would comb every inch of the countryside, following trails, looking for clues, and eventually they would come here, to the farm where it all began. Jake stared down at Morrison's wrapped corpse, then at the half-dug grave. There wasn't enough time. Even if he worked through the night, even if he managed to bury the body and cover his tracks, the FBI would find something, They always did. Jake retrieved his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Agent Rebecca Chen's number. She'd given him her card weeks ago when the investigation first began, told him to call if he remembered anything about his grandfather's activities. Well, now he had something to remember. The phone rang twice before Chen answered. "Agent Chen, this is Jake Whitmore. I need to talk to you about Sheriff Morrison." A pause. "Mr. Whitmore, where are you right now?" "At my farm." "And Agent Chen, you're going to want to bring your team. I have something to show you." Jake ended the call before she could respond. His hands shook as he began unwrapping Morrison's body, positioning it carefully near the old storage area where he'd first discovered his grandfather's secrets. He retrieved Morrison's service weapon from where he'd hidden it and placed it in the dead man's hand. The story Jake would tell was simple. He discovered Morrison searching the barn, looking for evidence to destroy. When Jake confronted him, Morrison had pulled his gun, threatened to kill him just like he'd killed others who'd gotten too close to the truth. In the struggle that followed, Morrison had struck his head on a metal beam and died instantly. It wasn't perfect, but it was believable. Jake's fingerprints were already all over the barn from his renovation work. The evidence of his grandfather's crimes was still here, still damning enough to provide motive for Morrison's desperation. And Jake's reputation as an honest man would work in his favor. Who would suspect the grandson of a criminal had killed to cover up crimes he'd been trying to expose? Jake heard the distant rumble of engines approaching. The FBI was coming, just as he'd known they would. He took one last look around the barn that had housed so many secrets, so much pain. Then he walked outside to meet his fate, rehearsing his story one final time. Some family legacies, Jake had learned, could never truly be buried. They lived on in the choices of each new generation, in the lines they were willing to cross to protect what mattered most. As the federal vehicles crested the hill, Jake squared his shoulders and prepared to add his own chapter to the Whitmore family's dark history.